the national government has not succeeded in forming an effective national administration. So smuggling routes for people coming from sub-Saharan Africa really are controlled by criminal networks, some of them
Mm.
connected to the government and paid by the government. So to some extent, it can turn the tap up or down, but it can't control it completely.
In February of 2011, protests against the former leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, began 15 years ago precisely. Libya's version of the Arab Spring was met with harsh military suppression. The Gaddafi regime used live ammo, tanks, airstrikes and mercenaries to attack demonstrators, resulting in hundreds of deaths in the first few days. NATO ultimately responded by imposing a no-fly zone and an arms embargo. The conflict ended with the fall of Tripoli in August 2011 and the death of Muammar Gaddafi in October 2011. What followed was a power vacuum and prolonged civil war, which has left Libya defined by many as a failed state. Well, let's speak now to Richard Northern, former British ambassador to Libya. Richard Northern, it's great to have you on the Times at One. Tell me a little bit about your experiences on the ground in Libya during this period of revolution and instability.
It was a fascinating period. Thank you, Stephen. I was there when the uprising started, when the demonstrations happened. It was all, in spite of the build-up, thanks to the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt and neighboring countries, it all happened remarkably fast with very little warning. Everybody had assumed that the Gaddafi regime was so tough and so strong that it wouldn't brook any dissent and that people would be afraid to complain. But when it happened, thanks, as you say, to the strong, heavy-handed repression and reaction by the armed forces, it escalated very, very fast, and the country soon, within days, effectively, was out of control.
If NATO hadn't then intervened, and I talked about the no-fly zone, the arms embargo, and a clear NATO stance that they were not going to sort of stand by and watch Gaddafi reimpose brutal power, if that hadn't happened, could Gaddafi have survived?
Probably could have survived. We don't know exactly what would have happened. NATO intervened because his armed forces had surrounded the city of Benghazi with 1 million civilians living there. And everybody assumed that the way those civilians would be treated would be horrific if he was allowed to continue. So NATO was authorized to intervene to prevent that massacre. Um, had that happened, Gaddafi would almost certainly have survived. What would have happened afterwards, we don't know. Demonstrations would almost certainly have continued because the Arab Spring set off a reaction which was hard to put back in the bottle once it had burst out.
Yeah, given the, as you've just pointed out, the significance of the NATO involvement, do we therefore have to acknowledge, some 15 years on, that we, that is member states of NATO, bear some responsibility for the terrible, terrible aftermath of the toppling of Gaddafi? The fact that, you know, for so many years now, we've seen hugely complex civil war inside Libya. We've seen it become essentially a failed state, and we have a responsibility. Would you agree with that?
I would agree that we have a certain level of responsibility. With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to see now that the international community as a whole, not just NATO, should have done more to help Libya after the fighting stopped and to try and establish some form of working government there. As you say, it is a bit of a failed state now. It's stuck in a fragile and uncertain situation with really no peace, no war. Fortunately, there is no large-scale violence now. That's rare, but there have been major periods of fighting in 2014 and 2019. So undoubtedly, more could have been done perhaps to help Libya stand on its feet after the fighting.
And because of the chaos in Libya and the lack of real central authority and governance, what we've seen over years is that Libya has become a key way station in migrations from the poorest parts of Africa into Europe. And, again, it's something that has had huge impacts in Europe and on European politics. Is that now changing? Is the Libyan government, such as it is, in any position now to control that flow of people?
Have a certain amount of control, but the problem in Libya is that the government, and indeed there are two government administrations in the east and the west, really doesn't have effective control over the territory. One of the problems was that the uprisings were not conducted by a single political movement with a single unified leadership. Really, it was a question of spontaneous uprisings in each community trying to free themselves from the Gaddafi regime. They have been unable to come together, and the most effective level of government now is really at municipal level. It's the local town councils who organise day-to-day services and maintain order in communities. The national government has not succeeded in forming an effective national administration. So smuggling routes for people coming from Sub-Saharan Africa really are controlled by criminal networks, some of them connected to the government and paid by the government. So to some extent, it can turn the tap up or down, but it can't control it completely.
I mean, you stopped being our man in Tripoli quite some time ago, but if you were still advising the government, would you say, and not just the British government, but other European governments too, would you say, you know what, you ought to spend more time looking at what we can do to make Libya a more functional country with a stronger government and with a real commitment to ending the flow of people from its shores, because that is in the West's interest. Do you think that should happen? Do you think it will happen?
It is in the West's interest. I don't think that the UK government has a great deal of influence over what happens in Libya, but I think it's important. The only way to achieve progress is for the international community, and the UN has been doing its best, but it needs more widespread support, particularly from regional powers who are closely involved in what happens in Libya. Egypt, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Italy even. These countries do have real influence, and they've tended to pursue their own economic and security interests rather than getting behind the UN.
Richard Northern, it's been great to talk to you.